All right. Hey, Heather, how are you?
Hey, Katie. Good. How are you?
Doing pretty good. We've had a couple of awesome interviews so far, but I'm super excited to talk to you as somebody who's actually not working for Microsoft. You're at Geocaching HQ. Thanks for taking the time.
Of course.
So before I get into my long list of questions on the side here, which I'll be kind of looking back and forth at, I was hoping you could give a little bit of an introduction about yourself, maybe what you do at geocaching, but also I'm really excited to talk to you about your career transition from data. So maybe talking a little bit about that timeline as well.
Sure. So I'm currently a software engineering manager at Geocaching HQ, and my background is in dotnet development and so in software engineering. And I currently manage the mobile teams at HQ, so the iOS and Android teams that work on our mobile apps.
Awesome. So you're currently a manager, and I just wanted to ask, so I know before you did some data and then you learned development. How long ago was that, and kind of what was that process like?
Yeah, definitely. So it was quite a bit ago, about a decade ago, that I got into software engineering. And I was, as you mentioned, originally a data analyst. So going all the way back to my college days, I studied Spanish and also math. And when I graduated, I remember thinking that I wanted to do something like really applied with math. I was pretty interested in statistics. And so I got a job as a data analyst, and I was doing a variety of data analysis, statistical analysis, and I really enjoyed that career. I was working with a programming language called R. It was like a scripting language that at the time was really common in stats. And I was creating small, like basically web apps with that language in my spare time at work because I was creating kind of dashboards to see the data in a little bit more of a fun way. And I really enjoyed that aspect of it. And so one day I showed a coworker that kind of one of the projects that I had worked on, and that coworker happened to be a software engineer. And he was like, "Oh, we could really use more software engineers at our company if you're willing to do software engineering." And the thought had never struck me to be a software engineer, frankly, because I hadn't studied computer science. And so I remember thinking, that's really interesting. Like I really did like making these small web apps, but I just had never thought about that, like transitioning into software engineering. And then eventually they actually officially offered me a role as a software engineer. And I thought long and hard about it because I did also like data analysis. But I decided, I'm going to try something new. I can always go back to what I was doing before, and took the leap. And here I am. I've loved it ever since.
Wow, that's so cool that you kind of were presented that opportunity based on work that you were previously doing and were able to do that transition at your role. I feel like that must have been very helpful in the process. And I'm kind of wondering, because from my impression, it sounds like you already kind of started this application development journey prior to even being a software developer. Like, how did you learn those skills? I know it was on your job, but did you use particular resources? Was it kind of an implied part of being a data analyst, or was it something you went off and did?
Yeah, it certainly wasn't an implied part about around being a data analyst. It was, I was using some tooling that was similar, right? The scripting language, and also even in Excel, creating, small macros that you can write essentially a tiny program in. So there's some overlap in skill set there, but certainly it wasn't like the same tooling or the same background as a typical software engineer. And so how that transition worked when I was offered the role as a software engineer is that I was essentially put on a team with other software engineers at the company, and then slowly kind of siphoned off my data analysis work and started working with the team. And really, like, my teammates at the time were mentors for me, and they showed me kind of the basics of getting started with setting up a program. And I also did some self-study to watch a few, online videos and tutorials about programming and C# and kind of learned on the fly in that way. And so there was certainly some overlap in skills, but it was a lot of learning on the job.
Wow. So that they put you on that team kind of right away, and then you started to transition. That must have been kind of intimidating. Like, I'm glad you had some great mentors, but I'm wondering, when you kind of reflect on that experience, what was kind of most difficult, but also what was the easiest given your background? Do you remember any specific things that came up where you're like, wow, like this is something I haven't encountered before?
Yeah, I would say the most difficult, at least at the point of me making the decision to become a software engineer, was more like emotional than skill based in terms of difficulty. It was giving up a career that I had kind of imagined and giving up that track of what I might do. And so it's hard sometimes to make those transitions because you're not really sure. You want to cling to the familiar and you're not sure if this new path will be the path that you really will find joy in. But I had been given advice to kind of know that I could always, even if it were in a different company, I still had that skill set that I kind of was coming into software engineering with. And so I could always go back and do that or grow in that skill set again, that data analysis skill set. If I wanted to, I can try something and pivot, right? Life is open to changes in that sense. And so I think that was the hardest thing for me was jumping into the unknown and not knowing much about the career and not knowing if I was making a decision that was right for me. And then I guess in more of a technical sense, it was really, just helped by having folks help me along. And I really enjoyed the aspect of writing some code and creating something that multiple people would use, like many, many people. I think that's one difference between data analysis and software engineering is that when I would do like data reports, some people would see those reports and they would certainly be effective, hopefully, and useful. And sometimes like important people would see those reports too, and it would really help the business make decisions. But there's really a small audience in the work that I was doing. And with software, there can be a really large audience in the work that you're doing, and you can affect other people's lives in this way that I find really fulfilling.
Yeah, that completely makes sense to me and definitely resonates. And I'm expecting us to have some folks watching this that will probably either be considering a career change of some sort or maybe currently in that process. I know you mentioned a couple of factors in your decision, like number one, the comfort that you'll always have those skills and you can go back. I'm wondering, are there any other factors that you remember considering as you were thinking through this choice to go to software development?
That's a good question. I don't know if there
It's
were.
okay if nothing
Sorry.
comes. I know I'm trying to reach into a period 10 years ago. I'm just so interested in, I feel like I talk to so many people, both through my job, but also friends even who are kind of considering career switches. And there's so many different things that tend to come up. Sometimes it's a financial one, sometimes it's skills-based, sometimes it's job prospects. And I think you are in a very interesting spot where kind of data and software both are on pretty even playing fields in those regards. So I was just curious if there was anything else that kind of popped into your mind as you were considering those options.
Yeah. I mean, you make a good point that I think a lot of those weren't factors for me as much just because of kind of the unique transition that I had. And I think mostly just that I was interested in kind of doing more problem solving. Like I really did like the problem solving aspect that was kind of a crossover between data analysis and software engineering. You can find that in both of those spaces. But again, what I found really compelling about software engineering was just this ability to really like write some code that millions of people can see or utilize or can help them. And not that many careers have that. So I think that really called me to try software engineering, and I did love that aspect of it, and so I've loved it ever since.
Yeah. At what point did you feel like, oh, this is real? Like I've made it, and I'm a software engineer now. Was it when you first joined that team, or was it some later milestone for you?
It was probably a later milestone. I think probably when I, created my first like greenfield project and felt really comfortable working in a project and writing code and writing classes from scratch and really feeling like I had a good grasp on what I was writing and what I was doing. I would say that's when I probably felt that I was a true software engineer.
Yeah. And this next question, I have to add a disclaimer, like it's going to be different for everybody and every kind of career change, but I'm wondering if you could talk me through kind of the timeline of this. Like when did you made your switch, you joined the other team? How long did it take you to feel like you knew what you were doing? And how long did it take you to get that first greenfield application?
Yeah, that's a great question. I probably had, 3 to 6 months where I felt like I was really becoming like starting to, I guess, get on my feet within the role because there was maybe a 1 to 2-ish month period where I was doing a little bit of both roles and kind of rolling off of my old work and into new work. So that time period was probably a bit longer than someone who's transitioning and just starting a full-time role as a software engineer. But yeah, I would say 6 months probably before I really felt that feeling of like I have confidence in knowing what I'm doing and really feeling like I can dive into a project and do work that's pretty independent and not needing as much guidance from others.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. I feel like there's just there's so much that goes into that transition. I'm actually shocked at how short it took you to kind of onboard and feel comfortable, but that's so amazing. Now that you're kind of on the other side of it, I'm wondering if you have any advice for folks who may be kind of either starting or in the middle of this kind of journey. And, it is 10 years later, but is there any advice from when you were doing it that you think would be valuable to somebody who's just starting that?
Yeah, definitely. I would say that seeking out different forms of learning. So if you're, trying to learn a specific programming language or programming platform, that there are, of course, many online resources nowadays. And depending on how you're doing your transition, that you might have mentors or friends, perhaps, others that can help you. But kind of going for other styles. So, for example, if you try to watch one online video and it doesn't really resonate with you, try a different online video, maybe with a slightly different topic or from a slightly different person, right? Everybody has a different learning style. And so sometimes what sticks for one person doesn't really stick for another. And I do recall that way back in college, in my math degree, I had to take a coding class actually. And I don't remember really enjoying it that much, right? It was kind of like the pen and paper. We weren't actually, you had to write out the code. You did do a little bit on the computer, but a little old school. And it didn't connect with me, right? But learning how to code with peers that were willing to teach me and also learning via a few online videos that I really had that resonated with me, I think helped me kind of see what I could do and see the passion in the work. And additionally, I think just like getting your hands dirty and starting up a project and writing your own code, even if it's something really simple, can be a really fulfilling way to connect. So if you're like watching a tutorial, instead of just watching it, doing some of it yourself, that can be a really good way to kind of jumpstart your learning. And my last piece of advice would probably be that within that, considering creating something that connects with maybe a passion that you already have. So if you have a hobby or an interest outside of software engineering, I always find that if there is, like let's say you like music and you're like, I'm going to create a music app to inventory all my music. If you're doing something and you're creating a project towards something that you're passionate about, then I think some of those other skills that you're learning come a little bit easier because you're just so focused on the end goal of what you're creating that you're naturally absorbing a lot of that information and that knowledge. And that can be a really cool thing to reflect on and know that like, hey, I was just passionate about making this app, but now I know, all these new skills. So that would be my advice.
Yeah, definitely. I can totally see you mentioned you're really into problem solving. I can definitely see that coming through, especially with that last piece of advice and, really trying to kind of scope your own learning to something you're interested in and put it in context. I think that's really cool. So kind of final question in this line of questioning is if you could go back in time and change anything about that transition, if there were any hurdles you faced that you think you could have navigated differently, would you change anything, and what would that thing be?
Yeah, I actually don't think I would change much. I really have enjoyed my career as a software engineer, and I'm glad that I took that leap, and I'm glad that I guess, took the risk and tried a different career path. And so I'm happy with that change. And again, at the time, I do remember feeling pretty hesitant about, whether or not that was going to be something that I wanted. And it feels like a big deal to change your career. It feels really heavy. It feels like your entire life is going to change, and maybe in a way that you don't want it to. But for me, I would say my entire life did change, but in a positive way. And again, that folks can always pivot and change to something else. It's never so permanent. But I wouldn't change much. I guess if I had to change one thing, I would have tried to become a software engineer earlier, because I do find the work more fulfilling. And maybe that's a cheesy answer, but I wouldn't change too much, frankly.
Awesome. I have one final question. Then I'd like to open it up to you to see if there's anything I missed that we should have talked about during this conversation. I'm wondering, because now that you're a manager, do you ever run into anybody who went through a similar career transition, and what's it like being on kind of the other side, either as a mentor or as a peer to them? I'm not sure if you have. That's totally fine if you haven't. I just was curious.
No, that's a fantastic question. I definitely have worked with a lot of software engineers whose backgrounds aren't computer science either, right? So it is a common degree or common background for software engineers, but it's also pretty common for folks to come from other areas, and sometimes backgrounds that are wildly different, like art, or I was an artist and then I got into software engineering. And so you really shouldn't feel limited by your background. I've met plenty of software engineers, very talented ones, that haven't been a software engineer forever or haven't always known that they wanted to be a software engineer. But yeah, I would say that sometimes I do see some imposter syndrome in folks who, as like a manager or a mentor, in folks who don't have that traditional background. I think there's often this feeling of like, I didn't get the training that someone else got in my schooling, and so I must be missing something, right? Like, even if I have all this on the job training, that there's something about the schooling or the philosophy of code that I might be missing. And so sometimes I see some imposter syndrome where folks feel like they don't have everything it takes to be the best engineer. And I absolutely, would say that they do. And so most people that I see that in are really good at their job, and they're not usually missing out on too much in terms of concepts. And so having that, like in having that hands-on experience, I would say, is the most important. And some like programs in school right now do have good paths that they're trying to have young adults. I almost said kids, sorry. Some programs have paths where they're having young adults like really learn what it's like to do software engineering in a company. And I think that's really great, but some programs still don't. And so it actually is more helpful sometimes when people come into the job knowing a little bit more of the concepts that they would use on the job rather than just the theory of computer science. And so never doubt your hands-on experience, I would say.
Yeah. I love that. I think sometimes traditional education can really focus on the theoretical side, but sometimes just having those applied skills really makes the difference. And it doesn't matter where you learn those, it just having them and having the openness to continue to learn. All right. Well, thank you so much, Heather. This was so helpful. And I know I learned a lot. I'm sure the viewers learned a lot as well. We have a couple more sessions today, so I'm just going to go ahead and hand it on back for the next one. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie.